When a woman's husband lives abroad, her entire life often feels like a series of restless days and sleepless nights. She's caught between memories of her husband and the seemingly endless wait for his return. At every moment of joy or sorrow, she finds herself utterly alone. This isolation can sometimes lead her down a path not just misguided, but morally wrong. Many men believe that women are only after money, but the truth is far more profound. Women crave love and affection. When they find it, they hold on to it tightly, wherever it may come from. A woman without her husband often feels a deep sense of loneliness. Every night becomes an ordeal, like trying to sleep on a bed of thorns. She longs for the comforting presence of her husband's shoulder. If it's not there, she might seek solace in the companionship of another. While society labels this as betrayal, it's also a form of injustice against her. Deprived of rightful comfort, she's condemned when she finds it elsewhere. This story is about such a woman. In fact, it's about my sister-in-law, Rabia. Forced by loneliness and her emotions, she took a step that needs to be discussed openly. Rabia often appeared despondent and troubled. I'd caught her crying in private many times, and I assumed she missed my brother. Her tears were never mentioned, and I never directly asked her why she wept. She spent her days silently attending to household chores and locked herself in her room each night, where I could hear the soft sounds of her sobs. My brother had left for Australia just a week after their wedding, and he couldn't return for at least 5 years. For a newlywed, that's an incredibly long and difficult time. However, my brother had married her primarily for the sake of our family. After our elder sister's marriage, I had been left alone in the house, and we needed a woman to manage things. So, when my brother returned for the wedding, he arranged his own marriage before departing, leaving Rabia in my care. Rabia was thus entirely alone, and I took on the responsibility of looking after her. She was already middle-aged when my brother married her. Her family had struggled to find a suitable match, so when my brother proposed, they quickly accepted. That night, as I lay down to sleep, Rabia called out to me from her room. It was late, and I couldn't imagine what she might need at such an hour. I hurried to her room, knowing that my brother had entrusted me with her well-being. I had always tried to fulfill her needs, not just because of my brother's wishes, but also because I relied on his money and wanted to keep things smooth between us. I didn't want her complaining to him or encouraging his early return, as his homecoming would put an end to my free-spirited lifestyle. Over the years, whenever he mentioned coming back, we found ways to delay him, expenses, emergencies, anything to keep him away. This is why, in the past 20 years, he never seriously considered returning permanently. Now, at midnight, when Rabia summoned me, I assumed she needed help with something important. As I entered the room, I hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the sight before me. My sister-in-law, Rabia, was lying on the bed, face down. The situation felt strange, almost surreal, and I found myself pausing at the doorframe, unsure of how to proceed. Summoning my courage, I called out to her, "Yes, Bobby? Did you need something?" I expected her to respond in her usual reserved manner, perhaps adjusting her dupatta and sitting upright as she always did. After all, Rabia wore her dupatta all day long and was careful about her modesty. This, however, was a sight I had never encountered before. Yet instead of sitting up or covering herself, she remained as she was and said in a calm, measured voice, "Nadim, come inside. I need to discuss something important." Reluctantly, I stepped into the room, keeping my gaze fixed on the floor. A surge of shyness washed over me. This was not how I was used to seeing women. I'd lost my mother when I was very young, and my elder sister had raised me, but even she never allowed herself to be seen like this. This was something entirely unfamiliar, and my unease was growing with each passing second. Rabia turned her head toward me, her expression soft but serious. Observing my lowered eyes, she spoke in a gentle tone. "Nadim, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. In this house, you're the only person I can rely on. My husband is far away, but you're always here for me through good and bad. I just thought that in this difficult time you would support me." Her words caught me off guard, and I glanced at her, unsure of how to respond. She continued, "I've been having severe back pain. Could you give me a massage?" At her request, I froze. It was as if my mind was stuck between disbelief and confusion. She went on aside, "Your brother told me you're very good at massages. He said you could cure his headaches in no time. That's why I called you, because I trust you." I couldn't help but smile faintly, recalling how my brother often asked me to massage his head. It was true that I'd done that for him numerous times, but this was different. This wasn't my brother, it was my sister-in-law. The thought of giving her a back massage felt entirely out of place, almost inappropriate. I didn't know how to handle this request, and a storm of conflicting thoughts ran through my mind. What kind of woman asks her brother-in-law for something like this? Isn't it improper for a woman to ask a man, especially her brother-in-law, to massage her? Despite her pain, it just didn't sit right with me. Yet the words to refuse her outright didn't come easily. I was living off my brother's support, and I didn't have the courage to speak out against Rabia, nor could I deny her request without risking her complaint to my brother. If that happened, I might lose the financial stability I relied on so heavily. Rabia gestured toward a bottle of oil on the dressing table and said, "This is very good oil. Just use it to massage my back, please." Her voice softened further, and her eyes glistened as if on the verge of tears. Seeing her like this made it difficult for me to refuse. It seemed she was genuinely in pain. Even though hesitation weighed heavily on me, I couldn't bring myself to say no. I picked up the bottle of oil and moved closer to the bed. Sitting beside her, I slowly poured a small amount onto her back and began to rub it in. My hands trembled as they made contact with her skin. I kept my eyes lowered, trying to focus solely on the task at hand and not let my thoughts wander. I had helped Rabia with many things before, running errands, fixing things around the house, but she had never asked for anything like this. It felt as though I was walking a fine line, one I didn't even know existed until this moment. The room was eerily quiet, save for the soft sounds of my hands working the oil into her back. As I continued, I couldn't help but notice her breathing, slow and steady, punctuated by quiet sighs that suggested she was finally finding some relief. Still, I didn't dare look directly at her. I kept my gaze fixed downward, my face flushed with embarrassment. The whole situation felt surreal. My hands were doing the work, but my mind was racing, questioning how I'd ended up in this position. The tension in the room grew heavier as the minutes dragged on. I wanted nothing more than to disappear, to be anywhere but there. Yet I couldn't just stop. If I did, it might upset her, and then she might tell my brother I had refused her. That would mean no more pocket money, no more comfortable living. I felt trapped, compelled to continue, even though every fiber of my being wanted to leave. As my hands worked the oil into her back, Rabia's soft sighs turned into muted expressions of relief. Her voice, though unspoken, seemed to say she was grateful for even this small act of care. Meanwhile, I fought to keep my focus, to push aside the growing discomfort and just get through this moment. Even though I managed to finish the massage, the emotional weight lingered long after I left the room. The experience had left me conflicted, caught between my duty to family and the awkwardness of a situation I never could have anticipated. Both my friends and I had indulged in the luxuries made possible by my brother's generosity. Moreover, Rabia had always been exceptionally kind to me. She never refused any of my requests for extra cash, nor did she ask any questions when I approached her. She simply handed me what I asked for. That night, I continued massaging her back for quite some time, all the while hearing her sighs of relief. Eventually, her sounds quieted, and I realized she had drifted off to sleep. I silently rose and slipped out of the room. My heart pounded as if I had just run a marathon, and a strange fire burned within me, a fire sparked by my first brush with such closeness to a woman. The feel of her soft, delicate skin, her graceful frame, and the sight of her smooth, radiant complexion left me both thrilled and unsettled. But as soon as the thought of her being my brother's wife came crashing down on me, I felt a pang of guilt. I vowed never to set foot in her room at night again. The next morning unfolded as usual. Rabia, dressed conservatively with her dupatta and in place, was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. When she placed the food before me, she thanked me with a warm smile, saying, "Nadim, you've eased all my pain. I'm so grateful." Her words left me feeling ashamed. I replied, "You've been doing all the housework on your own. No wonder you're so tired. I'll try to help out more, or maybe we could hire a maid." She looked at me with a faint smile and said, "My exhaustion won't truly fade until your brother comes back. When that day comes, everything will feel better." I didn't fully grasp the meaning behind her words, but they lingered in my mind. She returned to the kitchen, and I headed out for college. Throughout the day, her words and expressions played over and over in my mind. When I came home that afternoon, I found that my elder sister was visiting. I thought about pulling her aside and mentioning what had happened the night before, hoping to get some advice. But Rabia and my sister were so caught up in conversation and laughter that I never found the right moment. They had become close friends, and Rabia treated her with great respect. Eventually, my sister left, saying she had to be home before her husband arrived. I was left with my thoughts and an unresolved sense of discomfort. After a short rest, I stepped out of my room and saw Rabia struggling with a heavy bucket of laundry. She was making her way up to the rooftop to hang the clothes, and it hit me that all those clothes were mine. Guilt pricked at me as I realized how much effort she was putting into chores that benefited me. I quickly called out to her and took the bucket from her hands. Rabia was drenched in sweat, partly from the heat and partly from the effort she was exerting. Her clothes had become damp from the humidity, and it was clear she was physically strained. I averted my gaze out of respect and hurried up to the rooftop, helping her hang the clothes. When we returned downstairs, I noticed she was walking with a slight stiffness, as if in pain. Concerned, I suggested, "Maybe we should see a doctor. It seems like your back pain has gotten worse." Rabia gave me a faint, sad smile and replied, "This is just the result of my own mistakes." Her response startled me, and I looked at her in confusion. She quickly added, "Don't worry, I'll be fine soon." Then she retreated to her room, leaving me more puzzled than ever. Her words didn't make sense, and it felt like she was carrying some hidden burden. Lately, everything about her seemed like a mystery. At times, it even felt as if she was deliberately hiding something from me. As the afternoon waned and the heat began to subside, I realized I could use a cup of tea. I decided to ask Rabia for one and headed toward her room. Just as I approached, I heard her voice from inside. She was crying, blaming someone on the other end of the line, saying, "This is all your fault. The state I'm in today is because of you. I ruined myself by listening to you." I froze at the door, unsure of who she was talking to. It definitely wasn't my brother, because Rabia referred to him formally. Yet on the phone, she was using a more casual tone. As the meaning of her words began to sink in, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Could this be the real reason behind her back pain? That she was involved in something improper? Just the thought of it made my head spin. I returned to my room in a daze, trying to process what I'd heard. For a few minutes, I sat there, lost in thought, before impulsively dialing my brother's number. He sounded happy to hear from me and began asking how everyone was doing. I cut him off and said, "Why don't you come back home?" He was surprised by my sudden suggestion. It was the first time I'd ever said something like that. In the past, I'd always assured him that there was no need to rush back, but this time, I was desperate. He asked if something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I suspected. "I just miss you," I said instead. "If you can, please come back." He sighed and told me it wasn't possible. We talked for a while longer, but nothing was resolved. I hung up the phone, still consumed by unease. That night, Rabia called me to her room again. When I entered, she was lying down, just like before, and asked for another massage. Silently, I picked up the bottle of oil, avoiding her gaze. My hands moved mechanically as I worked, but my mind was elsewhere. All I could think about was how she could ask me for something so personal after betraying my brother. And why had she been talking to someone else? I felt certain that someone came to the house when I was at college. The next day, I left college early to see if I could catch anything unusual. But when I arrived home, I was surprised to find the door locked and Rabia gone. I waited at a distance, out of sight. When she returned, she was drenched in sweat, looking flustered. She unlocked the door and went inside. When I entered the house later at my usual time, I casually asked her what she'd been doing all day. Rabia rattled off a list of household chores but didn't mention leaving the house. Now I was certain something was off. The rest of the day passed in restless frustration. I wanted to know the truth, to find out what she was hiding. That night, she called me to her room again. I knew she'd ask for a massage, but I felt deeply uncomfortable. However, until my brother returned, it was my responsibility to take care of her. Despite my misgivings, I entered her room. This time, as I picked up the oil bottle, Rabia made a strange request. "Turn off the light first," she said. I paused, taken aback. She'd never asked that before. I hesitated and asked, "Why do you want the light off?" She insisted again, sounding increasingly nervous. Reluctantly, I turned off the light. As I sat down to start the massage, Rabia reached out and grabbed my hand. I was stunned. My heart began to race and anger welled up inside me. She was crossing a line and I couldn't stay silent anymore. "What are you doing?" I asked sharply. Her voice trembled as she replied, "Nadim, I need to tell you something important, but I don't have the courage to say it in the light." "That's why I asked you to turn off the light," she said. Rabia's voice trembled as though she was on the verge of tears. Then, gripping my hand tightly, she began telling me a story that left me stunned. Her voice was frail yet filled with years of bottled-up pain. "I was the eldest among my siblings," she began. "Our father was often sick, unable to hold a steady job, and so I took it upon myself to keep our household running. I found a job, supported my family, and even arranged my siblings' marriages. In doing so, I let my own life drift by, unmarried and lonely. As the years passed, proposals stopped coming, and I found myself completely alone." Then, after a brief pause, she continued, "That's when he came into my life. He made me believe in love. I started giving him my salary bit by bit. Whenever he asked for money, I handed it over without hesitation. He said he needed to marry off his sisters before he could marry me. I clung to those words and continued to help him, dreaming of a future together. For years, I supported him. He managed to marry off his sisters, and I waited, hoping that soon it would be my turn. But when I finally brought up marriage, he said he couldn't marry me anymore. He claimed I was too old, that he needed a younger woman. By then, he'd built a small business using my money, and with success under his belt, he no longer needed me. My back began to give out from years of hard work, and my spirit was shattered. I had spent everything I had on a man who never truly cared for me. Rabia's voice cracked, and I could sense the raw emotion she had been holding back. "When your brother's proposal came, my parents pushed me into marrying him. They said it was my last chance. I agreed, but deep down, I knew I was broken. Even after all I had done, my siblings never appreciated me, and the man I loved abandoned me. I carried that regret into this marriage." Her words were pouring out now, each one heavier than the last. "And then," she added after a long pause, "I found out something that completely destroyed me. Your brother called me recently to tell me that he had married another woman in Australia. He said that his marriage to me was just for your sake and for the household's sake. That's when I truly lost my mind. After a lifetime of sacrifice, I was left with nothing." Rabia was now openly weeping, her voice shaking as she spoke. "I tried to keep going, but my back pain grew worse. One day, while washing clothes on the roof, I slipped and fell. The pain returned in full force. I had no choice but to ask for your help with the massages. I felt ashamed, but I had no one else to turn to. Yesterday, I even went to my parents' house to tell my mother about your brother's second marriage. I told her I couldn't go on like this. She held my hand and said, 'Don't leave your husband's house. There's nothing for you here. Your sisters-in-law will never accept you.' That crushed me even more." She took a deep breath, her sobs subsiding for a moment. "Today I had to tell you everything. I needed you to know the truth. I was ashamed to have you help me, but you deserve to know that your brother won't be coming back. He's married now. I didn't want you to hear this from anyone else." With that, Rabia broke down completely, her tears flowing uncontrollably. The room was dark, but I could hear her anguished cries. My own eyes welled up, and before I knew it, I was crying too. We sat there, silently weeping in the darkness, her story echoing in my mind. I felt a deep sadness for Rabia. My brother had treated her unfairly, adding to the hardships she'd already faced. Her own family had wronged her in the past, and now my brother had abandoned her too. But I knew it wasn't just his fault. My siblings and I were to blame as well. We'd never let him return home, always finding excuses to keep him away. In the end, his loneliness pushed him to marry someone else while still abroad. After some time, Rabia spoke again. "I'll stay in this house quietly for the rest of my life," she said. "I'll take care of you in the home. Just don't ask me to leave. Your brother is never coming back, and I have nowhere else to go. I'm afraid that one day you'll send me away." I quickly reassured her. "I'll never do that. You've held this house together in a way no one else could. But I don't want you to live in loneliness. I think you should divorce my brother and marry me. Rabia looked utterly stunned by my words. I turned on the light and said, You deserve happiness too. My studies are almost done and I'll find a job soon. By the time you finish your waiting period, we can start a new life together. You're close to my sister, and once she knows the truth, she won't object. She shook her head, tears welling up again. I'm much older than you, she said. What will people say? They'll think I betrayed my husband overseas just to marry his younger brother. I said gently, What has this world given you that you care so much about its opinions? I have no objection to this relationship. Her composure broke and she began to cry uncontrollably. I immediately called my sister, explained everything, and she too was deeply regretful. She apologized to Rabia and supported our decision. Rabia eventually divorced my brother and is now completing her waiting period while I'm preparing for my final exams. Once they're done, we'll get married. So, what do you think? Is my decision right? Should I marry a woman 10 years older than me? I made this choice with my heart, without worrying about what society might think. But I'm curious, what does society have to say about it? If you liked this story, leave a yes in the comments and don't forget to subscribe.